The words were a blade sliding between the panels of the old oak door. "I never wanted her," my stepmother said, her voice the low, confidential murmur she reserved for her most sincere cruelties. "He was a widower, you understand. She was part of the bargain, a plain, silent little thing, a ghost at the feast." I stood in the hallway, a book clutched to my chest, the leather cover cold against my thudding heart. I had only been coming to ask if she needed assistance with the seating arrangements for the ball. A foolish, hopeful errand. I should have known better. Hope was a currency I did not possess. My father's reply was a sound I knew well, a noncommittal clearing of the throat, the sound of his cowardice. It was the noise of his surrender, the auditory signature of his long and complete abdication of fatherhood. In the face of Elara's polished tyranny, he had retreated into a fortress of passivity, leaving me outside the walls. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the door, the intricate carving of a lion's mane digging into my skin. A ghost at the feast. It was true. I had been fashioned into a creature of the periphery, my presence an inconvenience, my opinions an irrelevance. My world had been carefully, methodically shrunk until it consisted of shadowed corridors, dusty libraries, and the silent company of forgotten things. My stepsister, Serafina, was the sun around which our household orbited. She was all light and laughter, her beauty a dazzling spectacle that rendered me, with my quiet face and serious eyes, a creature of the shade. She was not unkind, not in the active, deliberate way Elara was. She was simply oblivious, wrapped in the warm, golden fleece of her own charmed existence, and she could no more see my suffering than one can see the dark side of the moon. The ball was to be the grandest of the season, a glittering affair to celebrate Serafina's 18th birthday. For weeks the house had been in a state of controlled chaos. Dressmakers and florists and confectioners moved through the rooms like an invading army of frippery. My own preparation was much simpler. "You will wear the gray muslin, Elspeth," Elara had declared, her eyes sweeping over me with a familiar dismissive appraisal. "It is suitable, unobtrusive. The color of invisibility, the fabric of a shadow." Her plan for me, as she had explained to my father with the chilling logic of a field marshal, was simple. I was to be stationed in the small, disused conservatory at the far end of the ballroom, a place of wilting ferns and dusty glass. "She can observe from a distance," Elara had said. "It would be cruel to deny her the spectacle entirely, but equally cruel to expose her to scrutiny she cannot withstand. She is far too shy, you see, terrified of crowds." It was a lie so perfectly constructed, it almost felt like a truth. I was not terrified of crowds. I was terrified of her. She had manufactured my shyness, cultivating it with years of casual dismissals and pointed remarks until it grew over me like ivy, choking the life from any nascent confidence. So I learned to live in the quiet spaces. My true life was lived within the pages of books, in the silent, ordered world of mathematics and architectural theory. There, in the elegant certainty of a well-turned phrase or the logical perfection of a balanced equation, I found a sense of belonging that my own home had always denied me. These were my secret companions, my silent rebellion. I had a mind, a quick and curious one, but in Elara's world, a woman's mind was a piece of furniture, unnecessary and best kept in a dark corner where it would not be in the way. The night of the ball arrived on a wave of silk and perfume. I dressed in my gray muslin, a moth in a house of butterflies. I watched from my window as carriages disgorged a river of jewels and color onto the grand stone steps below. Serafina, a vision in cream and gold, floated down the main staircase, her laughter echoing like tiny bells. My father, looking handsome and slightly lost, beamed at her. Elara, in emerald silk that sharpened the green of her eyes, stood beside them, the triumphant architect of it all. I slipped away before they could issue their final instructions, making my way through the service corridors to the conservatory. It was as I remembered, a sad, forgotten little room, smelling of damp earth and decay. The glass panes were grimy, distorting the glittering lights of the ballroom into blurry constellations. I found a stone bench behind a large, drooping fern, and there I settled, a ghost taking her designated place at the feast. The music was a muffled pulse through the thick glass doors. I could see the dancers, swirling figures of impossible grace and beauty. It was another world, one to which I had no passport. I opened the small book of poetry I had brought with me, its familiar weight a small comfort in my hands. I would endure. It was what I did best. An hour passed, perhaps two. The heat from the ballroom began to seep into my chilly outpost. The party had reached its zenith, a roaring crescendo of music and conversation, and then a sudden, perceptible shift in the atmosphere. The music faltered for a moment. The hum of conversation dropped. Even through the distorted glass, I could see heads turning, bodies parting to form a channel. A man was entering the ballroom. Even from this distance, his presence was a physical force, a point of gravity that pulled the entire room into its orbit. He was tall, dressed in severe, immaculate black that stood in stark contrast to the peacock finery of the other guests. He moved with a kind of lethal stillness, his face a mask of aristocratic severity. I did not need to be told who he was. This was Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, a man of immense wealth and legendary reclusiveness. He was a phantom of the social season, a name whispered in drawing rooms but never seen. And he was here, in our house. I watched, morbidly fascinated, as Elara, her face a perfect portrait of delighted shock, moved to intercept him. He inclined his head, a gesture so minimal it was almost an insult, his eyes never leaving the room. They were strange eyes, the color of a winter sky, and they seemed to miss nothing. They swept over the crowd, over the blushing debutantes and the hopeful mothers, over the preening young men, over my radiant sister, Seraphina. His gaze was not one of appreciation, but of assessment, as if he were searching for something specific and finding it wanting. And then his eyes stopped. They moved past the glittering heart of the party, past the orchestra and the champagne fountains, and settled on the grimy glass doors of the conservatory. On me. For a heartbeat, the world ceased to exist. There was only the weight of that gaze, a focused, unnerving intensity that pinned me to my bench. It was not a glance. It was a long, deliberate look. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. He had seen me, the ghost, the hidden thing. I shrank further behind my fern, my book falling from my nerveless fingers, but he did not look away. To my utter horror, he began to move. He walked away from my stepmother, leaving her with a frozen smile and an unfinished sentence hanging in the air. He walked past the mayor, past the wealthiest baron in the county, past my sister, whose lovely face was a study in bewilderment. He moved with a quiet, inexorable purpose, a black ship sailing through a sea of parted silks and velvets, and his destination was my pathetic, dusty little exile. The glass doors opened, and the sounds of the party rushed in, loud and intrusive. Then they closed, and a profound silence fell, broken only by the frantic hammering of my own heart. He stood there, a dark, towering figure against the light, his shadow falling over me. The air in the small room felt suddenly thin, electric. "Are you fond of ferns?" he asked. His voice was deeper than I had imagined, a low, resonant baritone with no trace of warmth. It was simply a voice that expected to be answered. I stared at him, my own voice trapped somewhere in my throat. I could only shake my head, a small, jerky movement. "Then you must be hiding from the music," he stated. It was not a question. I found a sliver of voice. I prefer quiet," I managed to whisper, the words feeling foolish and inadequate. He looked down at the book of poetry lying at my feet. He did not bend to pick it up, but simply acknowledged it with a slight dip of his chin. "So I see." His gaze returned to my face, and for the first time, I saw something other than severity in his eyes. It was not pity. It was recognition. A startling, terrifying flicker of it. "It is a crime to cage a mind like yours in a room with dying plants." My breath hitched. How could he know? What could he possibly know of my mind? We had never spoken. I was certain I had never been in the same room with him before in my life. "My name is Alistair Blackwood," he said, as if I could possibly not know. "And you are Elspeth." He knew my name. The Duke of Blackwood, a man who could command armies and bankrupt nations, knew my name. The shock of it was a physical blow. "Will you walk with me?" he asked, extending a gloved hand. I could not move. I could only stare at that hand, a stark shape of black leather in the dim light. This had to be a dream, or a particularly cruel joke. But when I looked at his face, there was no mockery there, only an unnerving, implacable seriousness. Taking his hand felt like stepping off a cliff. Not taking it felt like an impossibility. Slowly, hesitantly, I placed my trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm, cool. He drew me to my feet, his touch steadying me as I swayed. He then turned and, without another word, led me out of the conservatory and back into the ballroom. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The music stuttered to a complete halt. 1,000 conversations died in 1,000 throats. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the air. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, on the polished parquet that reflected the chandeliers like a dark, star-filled lake. I could feel the stares, 100 pairs of eyes like hot needles on my skin. I could feel Elara's fury, a palpable wave of heat from across the room. I could feel my father's bewildered panic. The Duke seemed oblivious to it all. He led me through the stunned crowd, which parted before us as if he were a biblical prophet. He did not lead me to the dance floor, or to the champagne, or to my family. He led me straight towards the grand entrance, to the doors that led out into the cool night air. And as we walked, he leaned down, his voice for my ears alone. 5 years ago, he said, his voice a low vibration against my ear. At a public lecture on Gothic architecture at the university, a young woman in a gray dress asked the professor a question about the divergent stress calculations for flying buttresses in seismic zones. The professor dismissed it. The audience tittered, but it was the most intelligent question asked that day. He paused as we reached the doors, which a footman scrambled to open. That was you, was it not? I looked up at him then, truly looked at him for the first time. The ghost of a memory surfaced, a stuffy lecture hall, a condescending professor, the sting of public ridicule. I had buried the memory under layers of subsequent humiliations, but he remembered. He had seen me. Not my plain face, not my quiet demeanor, but my mind. The cool night air felt like a benediction on my burning cheeks. He led me onto the terrace, away from the prying eyes. The world had tilted on its axis. The Duke of Blackwood had not seen a ghost in a corner. He had seen me. And I had no idea what that meant. The days that followed were a strange purgatory. At home, a frozen silence reigned. Elara treated me with a new kind of contempt, a watchful, venomous stillness that was more unnerving than her usual sharp-tongued cruelty. She was biding her time, waiting to see if the Duke's bizarre behavior was a fleeting whim. My father avoided me entirely, his gaze sliding past me as if I were made of glass. Only Serafina seemed genuinely perplexed. "The Duke of Blackwood," she repeated to me in the privacy of her room, her brow furrowed. "But he never speaks to anyone, and he spoke to you for ages. What did you talk about?" I could not answer her. How could I explain that he had spoken of buttresses and stress calculations? It sounded like madness. I was convinced it was over, a single, inexplicable aberration. I tried to retreat back into my world of books, to forget the feeling of his hand holding mine, to erase the memory of his eyes. I told myself it was a fluke, a moment of ducal eccentricity. But I could not quiet the treacherous flicker of hope that had been ignited in the dusty conservatory. It was a terrifying sensation, like harboring a fugitive in my own heart. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope could be crushed. Then the letter arrived. It was delivered by a liveried footman on thick cream cardstock bearing the Blackwood seal. It was addressed in a stark, decisive hand to me. Elspeth. Not to my father, not to the family. To me. Elara snatched it from the salver before I could, her fingers tight on the envelope. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "It is addressed to my sister," Serafina said, a surprising note of defense in her tone. Elara's eyes narrowed, but she handed it to me, her touch like a brand. I broke the seal with trembling fingers. The note was brief, its message a thunderclap. "The Duke of Blackwood requests the pleasure of Miss Elspeth's company for tea and conversation at his townhouse tomorrow at 3. The journey to his house the next day was a torment of self-doubt. Elara had insisted on accompanying me in the carriage, a silent, menacing chaperone. "Do not embarrass us, Elspeth," she hissed as we pulled up before the imposing stone facade. "Whatever strange game this is, do not imagine for a moment that it is real." Her words were stones, meant to weigh me down, to sink me back into the comfortable misery she had designed for me. I was met at the door by a severe but polite housekeeper, who led me not to a formal drawing room, but to a library. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with books, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. A fire crackled in a vast marble fireplace, and in front of it, in a worn leather armchair, sat the Duke. He rose as I entered. Today, out of the formal black of the ball, he seemed younger, though no less formidable. He dismissed the housekeeper with a nod and gestured for me to sit opposite him. I did, perching on the edge of the chair like a frightened bird. He did not begin with pleasantries. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze direct and unsettlingly perceptive. "Your stepmother believes I am playing a game," he said, his voice low. "Do you?" I do not know what to believe, Your Grace," I stammered. "My name is Alistair," he corrected me gently, "and I do not play games. I find them a tedious waste of intellectual energy." He gestured to the books that surrounded us. "This is my world, a world of facts, of history, of structure. I value clarity, and I value intellect. I have spent years observing society, and I have found it to be a morass of artifice and ambition. People do not say what they mean, and they rarely mean what they say." He paused, his eyes holding mine. "But you do. You are not a creature of artifice, Elspeth. There's a clarity about you, a stillness. I've seen you at social events over the years, always on the periphery, always observing, and I have always wondered what you were thinking." I was speechless. He had been watching me, for years. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I am not a fool," he continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "I know how you are treated in your own home. I have seen the casual cruelty, the deliberate erasure of your presence. It offends my sense of logic. To take something of value and treat it as worthless. It is an unforgivable waste." Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, hot and sharp. I fought them down. I would not cry in front of him. He seemed to understand. He changed the subject, gesturing to a large leather-bound folio on the table between us. "These are Palladio's original drawings. I thought you might appreciate them." And for the next hour we spoke of architecture. He was not testing me. He was conversing with me as an equal. He listened to my thoughts on proportion and form. He challenged my assumptions. He introduced new ideas. It was like finding a spring of fresh water in a desert. My mind, so long starved of genuine intellectual companionship, came alive. I forgot to be shy. I forgot to be afraid. I simply was. When it was time to leave, he walked me to the door. "I would like to continue this conversation," he said. It was not a question. "Next week, we will discuss Wren." He sent me home in his own carriage. As I rode through the darkening streets, I pressed my face against the cool glass of the window. Elara's words echoed in my mind. "Do not imagine it is real." But the weight of the Palladio folio in my lap, which he had insisted I borrow, felt very real indeed. The memory of his focused attention felt real. For the first time in my life, I had been seen, and the world felt entirely new. Our meetings became a regular occurrence, a secret, sacred ritual in the quiet heart of my week. We always met in his library, a sanctuary of shared thought. We moved from Wren to Brunelleschi, from architectural theory to philosophy, from the Stoics to the Transcendentalists. With every conversation, a part of me that had been locked away began to unfurl. He had a way of asking questions that drew out opinions I did not even know I possessed. He never complimented me directly, but his validation was implicit in the serious, focused way he listened, in the way he would argue a point with me for half an hour, treating my perspective with the weight and respect of a scholar. He began to show me other parts of his life. We walked in the private gardens behind his townhouse, a surprisingly wild and beautiful place. It was there, one cool afternoon, that he revealed a piece of himself that explained the solitude, the severity that clung to him like a shroud. We had stopped by a simple stone bench overlooking a dark, still pond. "My younger brother Thomas drowned here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet the words hung in the air with unbearable weight. "He was 8. I was 12. I was supposed to be watching him. I looked at his face, at the hard line of his jaw, the profound sorrow etched so deeply into his features it had become a part of his bone structure. I finally understood. His coldness was not a rejection of the world, but a shield, a penance. I did not offer him the empty platitudes of comfort. I knew grief. My own mother had died when I was very young, and my grief for her was a constant low hum beneath the surface of my life, a sorrow I was never allowed to express. "It is a heavy burden," I said softly, "to be the one left behind." My words seemed to reach him in a way nothing else could have. The rigid control he held over himself seemed to fracture for a moment. He turned his head and looked at me, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded pain that stole my breath. "Yes," he whispered, "it is." Instinctively, without thought, I reached out and laid my hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, meant only to convey a shared understanding. But the moment my fingers touched the fine wool of his coat, the air crackled. He looked down at my hand, then back to my face. Slowly, he reached up and covered my hand with his own. His touch was not passionate, but it was charged with a profound intimacy. A current passed between us, a silent acknowledgement of the deep, unseen wounds we both carried. In that moment, we were not a duke and a forgotten girl. We were just Alistair and Elspeth, two lonely souls who had found a flicker of recognition in the other's eyes. He held my hand for a moment longer than was proper, his thumb stroking softly over my knuckles. When he finally released me, the spell was broken, but something had irrevocably changed. A boundary had been crossed. I walked home that day in a daze. The hope I had so feared was no longer a flicker. It was a steady growing flame, and its warmth was both wonderful and terrifying. I was falling in love with him, with his mind, with his quiet integrity, with the sorrow he carried so stoically. And I began to allow myself a dangerous, fragile dream that he might be starting to feel something for me, too. Of course, Elara noticed the change in me. She saw the light in my eyes that I could not conceal, the faint smile that touched my lips when I thought no one was watching. And she could not bear it. My happiness was a personal affront to her, a disruption to the carefully ordered world in which she was the queen and I was the scullery maid. She saw the Duke's continued interest not as a miracle for me, but as a threat to her ambitions for Serafina. The Duke was the greatest prize in the kingdom, and he was wasting his time on a ghost. It was intolerable. She decided to act. Her methods were always swift, precise, and aimed at the heart. She chose a day when I had just returned from a visit with Alistair, my spirits soaring. She cornered me in the hallway, her face a mask of cold fury. "This little charade is over," she said, her voice a low hiss. "You have been amusing the Duke with your dreary little thoughts, and it has been quaint. But it is time for him to turn his attentions to a more suitable match, to Serafina." "What Alistair does is his own concern," I replied, my own voice shaking but firm. Using his first name was a small act of defiance, and it felt like a victory. Her lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Oh, you poor, foolish girl. Do you really think he is serious? A man of his stature, with you?" She laughed, a short, ugly sound. "He is amusing himself, but his amusement has gone on long enough. I've taken the liberty of correcting his misapprehensions." "What have you done?" I asked, a cold dread seeping into my veins. "I have written to him," she said, her eyes glittering with triumph. "A letter of friendly concern. I explained that you are a delicate creature, prone to flights of fancy and melancholic delusions. I hinted at a certain instability inherited from your mother's side. I explained that your attachment to him is a desperate, pathetic fantasy, and that for his own sake and for yours, he must end it, cleanly, immediately." The world tilted and went gray. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile glass house of my happiness. She had taken my hope, my beautiful, terrifying hope, and twisted it into a pathology. She had painted me as a madwoman, a desperate spinster, weaving fantasies about a man far beyond her reach. And the most terrible part was, it was believable. Who would he believe? A powerful, respected matron of society, or the plain, quiet girl who lived in her shadow? He will never speak to you again, Elara whispered, leaning in close. By tomorrow you will be nothing to him but a source of embarrassment, an anecdote he tells his friends, the mad little bookworm who thought a duke could love her. I fled from her, stumbling up the stairs to my room. I collapsed onto my bed, the sobs I had held back for a lifetime finally breaking free. She had won. Of course, she had won. She always did. My brief, impossible dream was over. The world was once again the cold, gray place I had always known it to be. The color of invisibility had returned. For 2 days, I existed in a fog of despair. I did not leave my room. I did not eat. I waited for the silence from Alistair that would confirm Elara's victory. The silence was absolute. My hope, which had burned so brightly, guttered and died, leaving behind only the cold ash of humiliation. I believed her. I believed every poisonous word. How could I not? It was the narrative of my entire life, confirmed at last. I was worthless, forgettable, and foolish to have ever imagined otherwise. On the evening of the second day, I made a decision. I could not stay in that house a moment longer. I had a small amount of money saved, a pittance, but enough to get me to a small town where I could perhaps find work as a governess. It would be a small, lonely life, but it would be my own. I packed a small bag with a few necessities and my most treasured books. As a final act of surrender, I took off the one piece of jewelry I owned, a simple gold ring that had belonged to my mother. It was all I had left of her. For years it had been a symbol of a hidden worth, a secret connection to a love I could barely remember. Now, it felt like a lie. I walked to the door of my room and left the ring hanging on the old iron doorknob, a final silent testament to the person I was leaving behind. I was no longer Elspeth, daughter of a loving mother. I was a ghost, and it was time to disappear completely. As my hand touched the latch to let myself out into the service staircase, I heard footsteps approaching. It was a housemaid carrying a silver tray. My heart sank. I had been discovered, but her eyes were wide with something other than suspicion. "Miss Elspeth," she whispered, "a message from the Duke of Blackwood." She held out the tray. On it lay a single familiar cream envelope. My hand trembled as I took it. It was not a letter of dismissal. It was a summons. My presence, along with that of my father, my stepmother, and my sister, was requested at his townhouse the following afternoon at 4 o'clock. I stared at the note, my mind reeling. It felt like a death sentence. He was going to end it publicly, to humiliate me in front of my family as a final cruel lesson. Elara's victory would be absolute. I leaned against the wall, the paper crinkling in my fist. Then, my eyes fell on the ring, still hanging on the doorknob. A tiny, defiant spark ignited in the ashes of my heart. No, I would not go to my execution like a lamb. I would face him. I would hear the words from his own lips. I slipped the ring back onto my finger. It felt cool and solid, a sliver of armor for the battle to come. The carriage ride to the Duke's residence was the longest of my life. Elara was triumphant, her satisfaction a suffocating perfume in the small space. My father looked ill, his face pale and clammy. Serafina was quiet, her gaze flickering between me and Elara with a dawning, troubled understanding. I alone was calm. I'd passed through the fire of despair and come out the other side into a strange, cold landscape of resolve. I had nothing left to lose. We were shown into the library. The room that had once been my sanctuary now felt like an inquisitor's chamber. Alistair stood by the fireplace, his back to us, staring into the flames. He turned as we entered, and his face was carved from granite. He looked at my father, at Elara, at Serafina, and finally, his eyes rested on me. There was no warmth in them, but there was no contempt either. There was only an immense, waiting stillness. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice filling the silent room. Elara opened her mouth to speak, to offer some saccharine pleasantry, but he raised a hand, silencing her. "I received your letter, madam," he said, his gaze pinning her in place. He produced it from his coat pocket, holding it between 2 fingers as if it were something unclean. A document of impressive creativity, a true work of fiction. Elara's smile faltered. "Your Grace, I was merely expressing a concern as a loving mother." "Your concern is noted," he cut in, his voice like ice. You claim that Elspeth is prone to flights of fancy. A curious accusation. I took the liberty of contacting Professor Albright at the university. He remembers Elspeth well. He shared with me a correspondence they have maintained for several years, a series of letters discussing complex principles of structural engineering. He described her mind as singularly brilliant and rigorously logical. These are not the letters of a fantasist. He took a step forward. Elara took an involuntary step back. You also made certain insinuations about the character of Elspeth's late mother, suggesting a certain inherited instability, he continued, his voice dangerously soft. My solicitor is a thorough man. He found it interesting that your own family, the Blanchards, were on the verge of financial ruin before your marriage to Lord Ashworth. He also found it interesting that a significant private debt you owed to a certain jeweler was settled, in cash, the week after your wedding. Elara went white. My father made a choking sound. But that, the Duke said, letting the silence stretch, was not the most interesting thing he found. He turned his gaze to my father. Lord Ashworth, were you aware that your first wife's maternal grandmother left Elspeth a substantial trust? A fortune, in fact, one that was to be managed by you and transferred to her upon her 21st birthday, which was 6 months ago. My father stared, his mouth agape. A trust? I knew nothing of this. Precisely, Alistair said, because your wife, he turned back to Elara, his eyes blazing with a cold fire, intercepted the correspondence from the solicitors. She has been systematically embezzling your daughter's inheritance for the past 5 years. The room exploded into chaos. Elara began to shriek, a torrent of denials and accusations. My father sank into a chair, his face in his hands. Serafina stared at her mother, her beautiful face a mask of horror and disbelief. And I stood there, frozen, as the truth of my life rearranged itself around me. It was not just cruelty. It was a calculated criminal campaign to keep me suppressed, impoverished, and powerless, to make me so small and worthless that I would never question, never demand, never claim what was mine. Then Alistair did something that silenced the room. He walked over to me, stopping directly in front of me, turning his back on the ugly scene unfolding behind him. He looked down at me, and all the coldness, all the severity was gone from his face. There was only a deep, aching tenderness. Elspeth, he said, his voice low and for my ears only, this is not my victory to claim. It is yours. His words were like a key turning in a lock deep inside me. The fear, the doubt, the years of believing I was nothing, it all fell away. I felt a strength I had never known I possessed rise up in me. I straightened my shoulders and turned to face my tormentor. Elara had stopped shrieking. She was staring at me, her face contorted with a venomous hatred. I found my voice. It was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it cut through the tense silence of the room. You tried to make me invisible, I said, looking directly into her eyes. You told me I was a ghost, a shadow, a thing to be hidden away. You told me I was worthless and foolish and mad, and for so long, I believed you. I took a step towards her. But you were wrong. You cannot erase a mind. You cannot steal a soul. You took my home. You took my inheritance. You tried to take my hope. But you cannot have myself. That is mine. I turned to my father, who was still slumped in the chair. And you, I said, my voice breaking with the pain of a lifetime of neglect. You let her. You stood by in silence, and you let her do it. Your peace was more important to you than your daughter. I will never forget that. Finally, I looked at Serafina. She was weeping, her face streaked with tears. She rushed to my side and took my hand, her grip desperate. Elspeth, I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I was so blind, I never saw. I'm so sorry. I squeezed her hand. Her ignorance was not innocence, but her remorse was real. The fight was over. Elara was utterly defeated, exposed and disgraced. Alistair spoke a quiet word to his housekeeper, and a moment later, my family was shown out. Elara shot me one last look of pure hatred before she was gone. The heavy library door closed, leaving Alistair and me alone in the sudden, profound silence. I stood trembling in the middle of the room, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining away, leaving me weak and hollow. The enormity of it all washed over me. The lies, the theft, the years of calculated cruelty. Alistair did not rush to me. He simply stood by the fire, giving me space, allowing me to breathe. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice gentle. "I never for a moment believed her, Elspeth," he said. "Her letter was a confession. Its cruelty was as plain and undeniable as your integrity." He crossed the room and stood before me. He did not touch me, but his presence was a warm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of my emotions. "I am not going to offer you my protection," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "You do not need protecting. I just watched you rescue yourself with more courage than I have seen on any battlefield. What I want to offer you is something else entirely." He took my hands in his. They were warm and strong, and my own trembling began to subside. "Elspeth, I have spent half my life in a fortress of my own making, convinced that the world had nothing to offer but artifice and grief. Then I found you, hiding in a conservatory, and you reminded me that truth and brilliance can still exist, even in the shadows. You have brought light back into my life." He lifted one of my hands and brushed his lips against my knuckles. My mother's ring was a cool circle of gold against his skin. "I am not asking to be your savior," he murmured, his gaze intense and full of a breathtaking vulnerability. "I am asking to be your partner, your equal, your friend, the man who gets to spend the rest of his life seeing you, truly, completely seeing you. Will you marry me, Elspeth?" The tears that came were not tears of sorrow or pain. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief, the release of a lifetime of worthlessness. He was not a prince rescuing a damsel. He was a man who had seen my soul and found it worthy. "Yes," I whispered, the word a prayer, an affirmation, a beginning. "Yes, Alistair. Yes." He smiled then, a true, unguarded smile that transformed his severe face, chasing away all the shadows. He framed my face with his hands, his touch infinitely gentle, and he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a fairy tale kiss, not a spark of frivolous magic. It was deep and sure and real, a kiss of profound recognition, of finding a home you never knew you were searching for. It was the end of a very long, very cold winter. 1 year later, I stood on the battlements of Blackwood Castle, the wind from the sea whipping strands of hair across my face. It was our home, a place of ancient stone and soaring towers, of logic and strength and history. Below me, in the grand courtyard, Alistair was overseeing the placement of a new buttress, a structural reinforcement I had designed myself. His face, turned up towards me, was filled with light and love. He was not the severe, solitary duke anymore. He was simply my husband. We had built a life together in the quiet year since our marriage. My inheritance was recovered, and my father, in a fit of belated conscience, had signed over the family home to me as well. I had offered it to Serafina, who now lived there with a newfound sense of purpose, managing the estate with a quiet competence I had never known she possessed. We were sisters again, in a way we had never been before. Elara had disappeared, exiled by her own disgrace to some remote corner of the continent. My life was filled with books and blueprints, with long walks along the cliffs, and with the quiet, constant companionship of a man who understood the language of my soul. We still spent our evenings in the library, but now we sat in 2 chairs pulled close together, our hands often intertwined as we read. He had not saved me from my life. He had given me the strength to claim it. I looked down at my left hand, at the simple gold band that sat next to my mother's ring. I was no longer a ghost at the feast. I was the Duchess of Blackwood, an architect, a partner, a wife. I was Elspeth. I was seen, I was loved, and I was, at long last, home.